As we said, we are continuing our study this morning in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. And last week we began looking at how God comforts us in our afflictions. We began by seeing how that each member of the Godhead plays a part in giving us comfort, both the Father, Son, and the Spirit. Each one does specific things in order to comfort us when we are afflicted or when we are going through trials here on earth. We saw where we receive comfort directly from the Word, and we'll talk a little more about that this morning. But God gives us comfort directly from His Word. There are several, His entire revealed Word gives us comfort, but maybe there are some particular passages, specific passages that may comfort us, and those may be different for each one of us, but we see that God does comfort us directly through His Word. We also see how comfort may come indirectly from God, and that is through the actions of His people. And so we are given specific obligations. We have specific obligations to each other, and that God has given us, and so God comforts us through others. And each one of us, I'm sure here, has been comforted by a fellow Christian, a brother or sister. There have been situations that we may be going through, different trials or afflictions. And so different Christians have come in and comforted us, maybe helped us in any number of ways. And so we see that God does that indirectly. We also saw how that to be a comforter, we must be a sympathizer. And so to adequately comfort those whom we have that obligation to do, so we must sympathize with them. And so in order to sympathize with them, then we must have love. And I don't think that if we don't properly love our brothers and sisters, we can't properly sympathize with them, and therefore we can't do a good job comforting them. And so we must have love, we must have sympathy in order to do so in a manner that's going to be the most beneficial to those whom we are trying to help. We also saw how that our experience allows us to help others through their trials. Different things that we have gone through, others may be going through that now. And so we can use the experience that we've had in order to better help those who are going through those things currently. We looked at Christ, and we see that part of what makes Him an ideal comforter is His experience, and how that all the things that He went through here on earth, He was tempted, He suffered, He was betrayed. All of those things He experienced here. And so now He, as we said last week, is our intercessor between us and God. And so He's there, and He has that experience. And so He's therefore, able to comfort us. We also saw that the comfort that God provides us is just not for our private consumption. We need to share that comfort. We need to do what we can to help others. We often think of trials solely as hardships, and sometimes we rarely consider the benefits that we gain from those trials, from those afflictions. But many times we come out stronger on the other side. Maybe our faith is stronger. Maybe we are in a better position to help others, in a better position to serve God. And those trials, those afflictions, many times make us better people. And so we need to think of things like that as we are going through these things, and especially when we're on the other side. Look at how we have grown throughout those trials or afflictions. We also saw how that we should follow the example of Christ in seeking comfort. When we look at Christ, we see that He humbly accepted the pain without trying to lash out, without trying to do things like that. He had done nothing to deserve it, nothing at all. Oftentimes we go through afflictions, we go through trials today because we have made foolish decisions. We've made mistakes. There are things that we have done, and so we're going through those things now, and it's because of mistakes that we've made. But Christ was perfect. He was sinless, and the things that he suffered, he didn't deserve at all. But yet he humbly went through those afflictions there. You know, it's not always easy to feel pain without blame. We often want to lash out. We want to blame somebody. We want to strike out. We want to place blame somewhere. But we see how that Christ felt no need to find someone to blame. That he simply accepted those things. He turned to God, just like we should. He turned to God to be comforted by him. And he wasn't looking for other people to lash out against. And so we need to endeavor to follow that example and to be like Christ. And as we were closing out last week, we were looking at how we can take comfort in the Scriptures. And we had some that shared some passages that brought them comfort. And I said that we would talk about some others if anybody had anything they would like to bring up this morning. Lauren did give me one that she said brought her comfort, and that's Hebrews chapter 4, verses 12 and 13. That passage says, "For the word of God is living and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the division of the soul and spirit, and of the joints and marrow, and is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. And there is no creature hidden from his sight, but all things are naked and open to the eyes of him to whom we must give account." And so, you know, sometimes I like this passage in reference to comfort, because I think this passage can provide comfort. We can take comfort in the fact that the Scriptures are supremely powerful, and that the Scriptures are able to do these things. You know, God is powerful, and we take comfort in that He's able to fulfill the promises that He has made to us. We looked a little bit about that last week, how that it's impossible for Him to lie, and so all these things that He has promised us are going to come to pass because He's unable to lie. And He has the ability to fulfill those promises. Well, the Scripture is just as powerful. His revealed Word is powerful as well. And it's able to help us in so many areas. He has given us some powerful tools in order to overcome different things in our life. You know, we don't have to wonder what we need to be doing to please God. We don't have to guess at that, because He has told us exactly what we must do to please Him. And we can turn to the Scriptures. They will tell us. You go to any bookstore, and probably one of the largest largest sections in the bookstore would be the self-help books. People wanting help to improve themselves in many different ways. Well, the Scriptures are the ultimate self-help book. They will tell us what we need to do to be a good Christian, to be a good servant of God, but they'll also tell us how to be a good friend, how to be a good spouse, how to be a good child, how to be a good parent. We can go to the Scriptures. They're powerful, and we can take comfort in that. No matter what situation we are faced with, we can find answers in the Word. Combating false doctrine, dealing with depression, worrying over the future, or even trying to help and comfort others. We can find all of that in the Scripture. And so it's comforting to know that we have that tool with us and that it is a very powerful thing. And so I like that, Lauren. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. Does anybody else have any passages in particular that brings them comfort that you would like to share with us this morning? As we said at the conclusion last week, we'll look a little bit in how that we can receive comfort in worship. And worship is comforting. There are many ways that we can receive worship this morning, or receive comfort this morning as we worship. We looked at previously, and a little bit this morning, how that studying His Word gives us comfort. As we go through His Word and we see all of these things, all of these promises, we study that deeper, we apply passages, we look at examples and maybe even modern day examples, things like that. As we go through these classes and listen to these sermons, as we study God's Word, it comforts us because it reassures us. It deepens our faith. It broadens our foundation. And so when we feel more sure about our situation, then we feel more comfort. We often talk about being out of our comfort zone. That's because we feel unsure about where we are at. But as we come into worship and as we study His Word, that increases our faith and it increases our it helps us understand exactly where we are at and what God can do, and it comforts us. And so studying brings us comfort. Prayer brings us comfort. Prayer is a very good way to comfort ourselves, or maybe comfort others. When things seem bad and you have someone else praying for you, what a great comfort that is, knowing that God listens and that He can provide strength. You look at 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 12, it says, "For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and His ears are open to their prayers, but the face of the Lord is against those who do evil." So how comforting is it to know that other Christians are praying for you and with you? And just the act of praying can be a great comfort to us. 1 John chapter 5, verses 14 and 15 says, "Now this is the confidence that we have in Him, that if we ask anything according to His will, He hears us. And if we know that He hears us, whatever we ask, we know that we have the petitions that we have asked of Him." And so God hears us. His eyes are upon us. And when you have righteous people praying for you, it can really comfort you. And when there again, as we look at how we can comfort others, just telling them, letting them know that we are praying for them, that can be a great comfort. Mentioning those who lead prayers here in the services, mentioning people specifically in those prayers, can be a great source of comfort to them. And so as we worship, we can be comforted by His Word, we can be comforted by prayer, we can also be comforted when we sing. Singing does a lot of things. And we often think of God's wisdom and the different ways that He has instituted all of these different things and the worship that He has us do. But singing can do a lot for us. There's just something about it. And when we are down, when we are struggling, when things aren't going our way, just even personally singing a hymn can lift our spirits. But how much more so when we come together and worship and we are all singing together. When we look at Paul and Silas, when they were in prison there in Acts chapter 16, and specifically there in verse 25, where it speaks of them singing when they were in prison. That would be a time when you would need comfort. And so we see how, obviously they were gaining comfort from singing hymns together there in prison. And so it's just like the singing service we had a couple of weeks ago. A lot of people here are in need of prayers, they're in need of help, they're in need of comfort. And those prayers, those songs that we sang really did a lot, I believe, to comfort many people here. And I heard several people mention how that was a really good service and how it just really helped them. And so we can receive comfort when we come together and we do these things. And that's why it's so important for us to make every effort to be here, even maybe when we don't feel 100%. And we have great examples of people even here this morning who don't feel well, but yet they come to services because they know, first of all, they have an obligation to, but yet they know what they receive. And comfort is one of those things that we receive from worship. And then we can also be comforted when we remember the death of Christ. When we remember what that does for us, what that means to us as Christians, that can comfort us. Ephesians 1 and verse 7, it says, "In Him we have redemption through His blood, the forgiveness of sins, according to the riches of His grace." And so this morning, as we partake of these emblems, and we think about what that means to us, all the things that we may have done in the past, many of us here have made some big mistakes. We have committed sins that we are ashamed of. There are things that we've done that we wish we could forget. But what we can have faith in is that if we have repented of those things, God has forgotten them. And that Christ has made it possible for us to get forgiveness. And so as we comfort, as we remember that and as we partake of these things, we can be comforted by knowing what that sacrifice means to each one of us. Because we each one needed it. And so we can take comfort in that. Any other comments or anything anybody would like to say along those lines? Yes, George.
In Isaiah, it's studying on Wednesday about character of the Old Testament.
Yes, sir.
Study for the prophet was to take Gomer, and that was symbolizing like Israel being a harlot.
Mm-hmm.
All right, in Isaiah 9, verse 12, 9:17, 9:21, chapter 10, 4, chapter 14, 27, chapter 5, 25, he repeats over and over. For all this, his anger is not turned away, but his hand is still stretched out.
Yeah.
All the evil they had done, he was still angry, but he still had his hand stretched out.
Yeah.
Want him to come back.
Yeah.
That ought to be comforting.
Yes, sir. That's very comforting. That's very comforting. And I was actually kind of thinking about that this past week as I was going through the Old Testament listening and how that God was always, and Moses was reminding him of that fact and things like that. So that's a good point. Very comforting.
Shane?
Yes.
Just to add to what you said this morning, there's for comfort. To me, there's a lot of comfort being able, and others won't agree with all this, so I'm not saying anything, great or mighty, but just my observation, To me, there's a lot of comfort being able to come here and see it and listen to the teacher and comfort to see who's here.
Yeah.
We're all here for the same reason.
Yeah.
And, you mentioned it, like the singing service we had, and at different times, if we miss a service, and we do, there's sickness and things that happen, but, when we come to services, singing services, whatever, different people at different times, we hear something that just builds us up. And, we may sit through 100, and they all help us, but then we hear that one that whatever's going on with us, whatever mental state or emotional state or, that we're in, we hear that that one thing right there, that doesn't. I mean, that helps us more than we could ever realize sometimes. And, even though we hear these, we hear sermons and we hear teaching, many times we've all done it over the years, we've heard a lot of teaching.
Yeah.
And they help us. But that one time, we may hear something that just really drive it home to us,
Yeah.
And all this other that was heard over the years comes in, and it's like you kind of say, I got it now. I mean, I understand things better.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of comfort.
Yeah. Yeah.
In that very thing right there.
Definitely. Anything else? David mentioned again something to me last week that I knew, but I hadn't thought of it in connection with it being such a huge blessing from God, is how that He comforts us with sleep. I know many times when we're worried and when we're struggling, sleep eludes us. But how many times have we finally fallen asleep and we have woken refreshed and things don't seem quite as bad as they did? How many times have the problems that maybe we were wrestling with the night before, as we wake up in the morning and we're rested and we're refreshed, they seem more like things that we can handle. They seem like not quite as large as they did the night before. And how that God had comforted us with that rest. Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and verse 12 says, the sleep of a laboring man is sweet. And that's a great source of comfort many times, just to be able to have a good night's sleep. And sometimes that benefits us in ways that may not even can be measured. But I thought that was a very good point, that God comforts us with sleep, and He has given that to us. Brother Bill Wilson spoke of how that God gives us comfort through His grace, and how meditating and thinking about God's grace can bring us comfort. And he noted Paul's example of the thorn in the flesh. And this will be, we'll, Lord willing, study this when we get to it. But 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 10, I want to go ahead and read this passage. But I kind of want you to look at Paul's attitude before God reminds him of His grace, and his attitude after God reminds him of His grace. Starting there in verse 7, it says, "Unless I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And He said to me, My grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness." And so here you have Paul that has this thorn in the flesh. We're not really sure what it was, but he was speaking about it buffeting him, and how that he was approaching God 3 times, asking God to remove this thorn in the flesh. And so we kind of, in my mind, we see a guy that's reaching, that's struggling, that's wrestling with this thing here, as he's asking God to take this from him. And then God reminds Paul, my grace is sufficient. And it seems like Paul says, yeah, you're right. You're right. Because then it goes on, it says, "Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities than the power of Christ, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, and distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong." And so oftentimes we are going through difficult times. There may be something personally going on with us, and we're struggling, and we're reaching, and we're praying, and we're trying to come to grasp with, well, why is this happening? But then when we compare it to God's grace, and And we think, he has given me so much. He has done so much for me. Just like we were talking about the way that he sent his son to die for us. When we start putting that in perspective and thinking about his grace and his willingness, as George says, him wanting and longing for us to serve him and to come back to him and all of those things, when we think about that, that can offer us great comfort. And so these things that we are going through, maybe when we put it in perspective to what God has given us, over here is huge. And then it starts making, maybe this thorn in the flesh look a little smaller and smaller and smaller. And so thinking and meditating about God's grace can comfort us. And knowing what He has promised, no matter what we're going through here, it's going to be worth it. It's going to be worth it in the end. And there's no way that any amount of suffering or anything like that can really equal the amount of pleasure and the amount of just happiness that we will be able to receive in the world to come. And so thinking about God's grace can bring us comfort. That's basically all I have on comfort. Again, I want to open it up. If anybody else has anything they would like to add before we move on, I'd be more than happy to hear it. Yes. Jeremy, you can go first.
Christ suffered. He came out. I think it's John 16:33, where he's speaking, and he says, makes mention of the fact, that He overcame the world. So we can look at His suffering, and obviously, if we do what's right and we live our life the way that we're supposed to, we're going to suffer the same way that He did. And for that, on that note, we can overcome if we follow His steps.
Yeah.
I think Peter talks about that fact, that we'll suffer the same things that He suffered if we do what's right. And you can look at, like even here in 2 Corinthians 1, you can look at the Apostle Paul. And you can look at Timothy. You can see, and he talks about some of the things that they suffered. And they could be comforted by the fact that God helped them through it. So in that way, and you mentioned some of these things, he even talks about them praying for him.
Yeah.
That they had His help in that way.
Yeah.
But, we can be comforted in the fact that, like Jesus said, be faithful unto death, and I'll give you a crown of life. So we have all these examples like they did. We can look back and see, hey, even though they went through all these things, they endured to the end.
Yeah.
They were rewarded, and they will be rewarded for the sufferings that they endured.
Yeah.
The sufferings.
Okay. All right. Who was it over here? Bill? Or all right, go ahead.
I appreciate what you said about 2 Corinthians 12, Shane. When Christ asked His disciples, do you want to leave me too? And Peter said to Christ, well, where else will we go? Who else has words of salvation? And that is a very strong verse to me. Just like this past week, I have been through a horrendous episode of depression, and I appreciate the prayers of the congregation here. I asked for it, and I got it, and I really, truly appreciate it. But during this whole time that I was going through this depression, which I do experience quite a bit of depression, a lot, because of my injury. But despite that, not one time did it ever sink into my mind, well, I'm just going to turn my back on God and do what Bill wants to do. I knew the whole time that God is my only source of refuge. He's my only deliverer. And I'm saying this right now to exhort and encourage anyone and everyone in this auditorium about when you go through these physical or mental afflictions, where else are you going to go? Even during that time of your affliction, to where you just want to give up, turn your back on God. Where else are you going? What else are you going to do? There's nowhere else you can go. Because as the psalmist says, God is my rock, He is my fortress, and He's my deliverer.
That's good points there. There are some here that suffer with depression, and I know I've never had to deal with that to the extent that many of you have, and I know sometimes when you're going through those things, it's hard to, your mind does stuff. But like Bill says, if you can just focus on God and what you know about God, that can help get you through that. Yes, Todd.
I think of scripture that there's no temptation such as common to man.
Yeah.
There's probably not a temptation out there that somebody else has not faced. And it's comforting to me to know that whatever I'm going through, there's somebody that else has went through that same situation that I may can talk to, can help you through that because they relate to me in that scenario. That's comforting to me.
Yeah, that is a source of great comfort because a lot of times, we may be struggling, maybe even as with a temptation or maybe any number of things, but what we need to understand is that's not unique to us. That somebody has struggled with that same thing before, and probably somebody that we know has done that. Not somebody 300 years ago that we've never heard of across, there's probably somebody we know that has struggled with that, with those same things, with temptations, with a loss, with depression, any number of things. And so nothing that we are going through is unique to us. And others have been through it, and others have come out on the other side better, and that can offer us great comfort, knowing those things. Anything else?
Okay.
Yeah.
I think about Paul's confidence in his salvation, 2 Timothy 4, verse 7 and 8. I fought a good fight, I finished the course. He said, there is laying up. Not, it might be, and I hope it is,
Yeah.
But he said, there is, and I will.
Yeah.
And that is a great comfort to us to know that there's a path. If we follow that path, there is laying up. There will be.
Yeah.
That's great comfort.
Yeah. We have that surety. Sure is. Anything else? I really do appreciate everyone's participation, those who spoke to me privately as well as those who have spoken up publicly. I think it was good for us to look at these things. It was good for me to understand God's comfort a little better, and I hope you were encouraged as well as we went through the study last week and this week as well. We don't have a lot of time at the end here, but we'll go ahead and dip our foot into the next section here. And Paul begins in verse 8 to speak of some of the suffering, some of the things that he went through in Asia. And so he speaks about that, and it's a good segue from our study about comfort into this, and we'll talk, Lord willing, about the prayer and what prayer did for him throughout these things, and look at that a little more closely. But we'll go ahead and read verses 8 through 11 to kind of set the basis for us there. It says, "For we do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, of our trouble which came to us in Asia, that we were burdened beyond measure, above strength, so that we despaired even of life. Yes, we had the sentence of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead, who delivered us from so great a death and does deliver us, in whom we trust that he will still deliver us. You also helping together in prayer for us, that thanks may be given by many persons on our behalf for the gift granted to us through many. And so here Paul speaks about a time when he was in Asia, when things were pretty bleak for him. There was a lot going on, and we read through that, and it kind of gives us a glimpse of his, of just the way things were, and maybe his mental state at that point. That there was a lot going on there. We cannot be for sure which events Paul is speaking of here, and you can go and you can read commentaries, and there's two or three things that people say, and opinions differ. Some people believe this to be, they're the riots that happened in Ephesus when Demetrius was stirring the people up there. It very well could. I think that's a very distinct possibility. Others believe it was the riots mentioned in Greece briefly there in Acts chapter 20 in verse 3. Possibly, I'm not sure. But it may even be some event that's not even recorded. But what we do know is that this was a bad time for Paul. That things weren't looking good. It was, you look at the language that he uses here, burden beyond measure, above strength. He despaired even of life. He had the sentence of death in ourselves, and that I don't know if that language there, and somebody here may have a better idea, if that actually means that he had been sentenced to death at this time. Yeah, George.
Lystra, the Jews from Antioch came and stoned him and threw him out of the city thinking he dead.
Yeah. So, he was in, whatever he's speaking about here, this was a tough time. A tough time. I look at this, and I personally have never been through anything that would compare to any of these situations. And, here Paul, he's struggling. He's really struggling at this point. It's easy for us to read about Paul and his persecutions, and we think, oh, Paul, he took that. He took that in stride. His faith was so great that, all these things just rolled off his back. That it really didn't affect him. But what we get here, we said a couple of weeks ago how that this letter is more of a personal letter, and we kind of get a glimpse of Paul as a person, the inside of Paul, just little glimpses here and there throughout this letter. What we understand is that Paul struggled. All these things didn't just roll off all the time. Now, I think sometimes they did. But what we see here is that Paul was having some difficulties here, and it was really affecting him. There again, we kind of went over this, but how that he was burdened beyond measure, above strength, despaired even of life. You think about that burden beyond measure. Some have translated that or said, kind of paraphrase this as completely overcast with burdens. He despaired of life. We look at Paul and we look at his writings, and we see Paul doesn't tend to overstate the matters at any time, really. And so I don't think that this was an instance where Paul was trying to gather sympathy for him and the things that he was going through. I think he was being honest here, and that he was really opening up to the Corinthians and showing them and explaining to them exactly his state of mind or the state of things that had happened since he had last seen them. So even though Paul expected to die, Paul learned a valuable lesson. It was a lesson that Bill was just stating a few minutes ago, that no matter what's going on, no matter how bad things look, we can rely on God. God is there, and God will bring us through. We are reminded of the Lord's words in Jeremiah chapter 17, verses 5 through 7. It says, "Thus says the Lord, cursed is the man who trusts in man and makes flesh his strength, whose heart departs from the Lord, for he shall be like a shrub in the desert, and shall not see when good comes, but shall inhabit the parched places in the wilderness, in a salt land which is not inhabited. Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, and whose hope is in the Lord." We need to put our trust, we need to put our faith in the one that will not fail us. If you put your complete trust in your service to God, your life as a Christian, and everything is dependent upon me, dependent upon Brother Hall or maybe one of the elders, something like that, then there's a good chance that you're going to be disappointed. Because none of us in this room are perfect. And at some point, we are going to fail. But we put our trust in God, like Paul did, and he's going to bring us through those situations. And so we can learn some very good lessons from this. Things may look dark. Things may look bleak. But then on the other side, we can be like Paul. At the end of our life, we can be like what Brother Henson was just saying a few minutes ago. I fought the good fight. I've finished the course. I've kept the faith. There he is. There is that crown laid up for me. So we can learn a lot from Paul. Lord willing, we'll pick up there actually in a couple of weeks. My family and I plan to be out of town next week. I believe Brother Reuben's going to fill in for me. I think he's going to kind of go a little bit different direction. But Lord willing, in a couple of weeks, we'll pick up here, continuing to talk here in verse 8 and the next few verses after that. I appreciate everyone's attention. Those who participated, I appreciate that. Thank you.